Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabeg, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. There have always been working class people who've bought into right-wing ideology and voted for the more right-wing of the parties of the ruling class, like the Conservatives in Canada and the UK, and the Republicans in the US. Just as an aside here, I think we shouldn't kid ourselves about the federal Liberals in the Canadian state and the Democrats in the US. There are also right-wing parties. Some Liberals in Canada are indistinguishable from moderate Conservative Party members, and there are lots of Democrats who are sort of like the non-MAGA Republicans. But the real point is that there have been significant changes since the so-called Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and especially in the last 5 years. As neoliberal capitalism has stumbled along, making most people's lives worse, we've seen what some people call an asymmetrical radicalization. That is, the right is becoming more reactionary, pushing for increasingly authoritarian policies. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, on a smaller scale, some people are becoming more radical against the status quo in a left-wing way. And we saw this, for example, with support for Bernie Sanders in the US and Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, just to give two examples from the so-called Anglosphere. Now, small business owners and self-employed middle-class elements are crucial for the hard right and the far right, but the right also draws some working-class support. Examples of this include worker support for, and to a smaller extent participation in, protests against public health measures around COVID-19, like the Freedom Convoy, so-called in Canada in 2022, which I think we should just be clear about from the beginning. Those were mobilizations for reactionary demands. And I say that because there are a few people on the left who think that these were protests with progressive aspects that then got co-opted by the right. We also seen some working class participation in the anti-trans, anti-queer, so-called parental rights actions, working class support for MAGA politics in the US and similar politics in Canada, for Reform, it's Nigel Farage's party in the UK, the National Rally in France, and the Alternative for Germany in that country. But growing support for hard right and far right politics doesn't just show up at the ballot box and in street protests, it also surfaces inside our unions as mass organizations of the working class. So radicals need to understand what's happening in order to fight it more effectively. And I'm really glad to be joined for this episode by two guests to talk about the problem and what we can do about it. Could you introduce yourselves?
Okay. Hi, my name is Stephen Tufts. I'm actually a professor at York University and the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. And I study labor unions, and actually I sort of thought of myself as being a labor geographer. So, and I have worked with a lot of unions in the past, continue to do so, and I'm particularly interested in the shift that you mentioned, David, of electoral support or endorsements for the Conservatives by unions, which is something we've seen in Canada and, of course, in Ontario with Doug Ford.
And my name is Catherine. I would say I've been a left organizer, activist since my early 20s. Most recently, I have been employed as a paramedic since 2010 for large Ontario ambulance service. The last 6 years, I've spent as the president of my union local. That ended recently when my bargaining unit made the decision to separate from my old local into a new local and create a new local. I am now in the process of going back into the workplace. For the last 6 years, I was on a union leave due to the position I held. And I also currently hold a member-at-large position on the CUPE Ontario Executive Board.
Thanks to both of you. So, Catherine, could you start us off by telling the story, summing it up in terms of what happened in the union local that you were a member of until recently?
Okay, so the union local that I belonged to was a large composite local, 29 collective agreements representing members working for 17 employers in Ontario, in the municipal sector, and as well as the library sector. So all public sector municipal employees effectively. So a few months ago, my bargaining unit, let's just say around 3,500 members, which is half of the entire local, made the decision to split from that local and form their own new union local, keeping its one bargaining unit, keeping the same collective agreement. And so that removed me from the president position, as I was no longer a member of that old local. I had just recently been elected to a fourth term by a very small margin of 41 votes on 2,400 votes. So I was about to serve the fourth term in the position. And within a month of the outcome of those elections, the executive of my bargaining unit announced that they would be proceeding with a vote to separate from the local. The vote, I organized against it along with quite a few supporters. They also organized very hard in workplaces. The vote was an overwhelming majority in favor of separating. I think something like 86% of eligible folks cast a ballot, and 3/4 of those votes were in favor of separation. The three key themes that really emerged through and in favor of the separation was strikes that the local had organized in the last couple of years, as well as organizing members to confront employers. That was a huge grievance, was that the local was engaged in strikes. Also, the issue of Palestine, and myself particularly as the president being quite vocal in condemning the genocide. And finally, accusations of misspending of union funds was another theme, which anybody who's ever been in a union is quite an easy and common accusation to levy against, especially leftist union officials. Well, I would say that in reality, it is right-wing union officials who are frequently actually truly found to be siphoning money out of union coffers. But in any case, I would say that this was, in effect, the separation was a complete right-wing takeover of a large municipal union local. The context of this particular union, like the geographic and political context, it lies in a very conservative area. It's a conservative party stronghold. It's also a Zionist stronghold. And to be honest with you, looking backwards on it, in retrospect, I think it was an incredible accomplishment that somebody with left-wing politics like myself held a president position for 6 years. And I think the reason that I was able to do that with a group of people around me was because we were very responsive to workplace issues and empowering workers to act collectively. And when we did that, and when workers did employ those tactics, they would frequently win. And I think that's really the only reason why I was able to stay in that position for 6 years. But even within the confines of business unionism, I would say I really fully use the tools of business unionism, tools like grievances and interest arbitration, to make gains for workers, because even folks that have those business union politics don't necessarily use those tools to the fullest extent. And really within the last few years, it was becoming very clear that as right-wing politics were rising within society in general, it was also appearing in the union. So I would say the first example was around you, David, you had mentioned the convoy. And it was COVID and employer mandated vaccination policies. And when we saw that happening, was the first time there was an organized right-wing presence of members coming into the union, being very disruptive, bringing in right-wing politics, making demands of the union. I subsequently found out that they were being aided and given advice by unscrupulous lawyers who were taking members' money, even though they obviously couldn't represent our members with the employer. And so instead of representing members around these issues with the employer, they were giving them advice about how to internally maneuver the union. So that was really the first time that I saw organized right-wing politics making their way into particularly my union local. Then the issue of, again, anti-trans organizing. targeting youth and children, and specifically, a couple of union officials, including Fred Hahn, being publicly attacked and doxxed by the far right for showing up at schools to defend children from the harassment that some of these folks were organizing in school zones. And we also heard about that internally, that, these are not things that a union should be involved in. This has nothing to do with our workplaces. And just anti-trans politics in general. And then most forcefully, I would say, starting in late 2023 with what I'm just going to call is actually the intensification of the genocide in Palestine. The Israeli lobby has poured an incredible amount of resources into destroying any opposition to the genocide within unions and among workers. Because I did use my elected position to say that the genocide was wrong. Myself, along with a handful of other union leaders, were viciously attacked. I actually had my members forward information to the National Post. They published a piece on me in particular. So that was really big. I also just want to say that this organizing around Zionist politics and that it tied back directly to the employer. Folks were using employer EDI groups to carry on this organizing within their workplaces. And I actually have to tell you, I've been surprised how much help right-wing union officers have actually gotten from employers in putting these politics forward, but also holding on to their positions, having preferential access to members at work sites. I can tell you when I was organizing against the separation, the employer revoked my workplace access completely. While I know that that is not at all what happened, they had free access to the workplace to talk to workers, to promote the separation. As well, union officials would file frivolous complaints to the employer about union activists, one of who got terminated as a result of that. So these are the kind of tactics where folk within unions that have right-wing politics actually work hand in hand with the employer to ensure that those politics are cemented into the union. And so I would say that the rise of the right, as this was happening, also coincided with the cost of living crisis. And you're seeing increasingly workers wanting and making the decision to go out on strike. And so we had a couple of strikes at my local. And again, as these right-wing politics were gaining ground within the local, there were internal attacks against these strikes. Always, the argument that this is not where union dues should be going to support striking workers, that this was too expensive. And so finally, these arguments got put forward that I want to leave this union because I'm going to be better off in my own local because my union dues won't be going to fund somebody else's strike, right? So, and I also just want to say, the separation or this divide of my local, I think, was possible because on the one hand, these politics are making serious ground within unions, but also I don't want to underestimate that these folks actually did do the legwork, right? They had people embedded in workplaces that were talking to workers every day. So this Jane McLevy model of one-on-one conversations, which they employed very successfully to basically organize against militancy and solidarity and to break a union. And I can tell you that after those two strikes that we had, and because we had been organizing workers in the workplace to actually confront employers and improve their working conditions, we were winning. We were seeing collective agreements being settled for higher wages. We were winning things in collective agreements. Employers were scared. They knew they had to make concessions to the union because if they didn't, their workplaces would be shut down. That was not a threat that they had ever been concerned about before. And they knew that that was very much what the local was up to and what the local was doing. And so it was just really sad to see how you can break a local just at the moment where we were already making significant gains and we're poised to continue making those gains as we were going into bargaining with one employer after the other.
Thank you for that, Catherine. Steve, do you have any questions for Catherine or thoughts about how Catherine's experience in her former local fits into your sense of the broader picture of what's happening in unions?
Yeah, I think it's the one question I think I would have for Catherine is making these links between the openness to right-wing infiltration of unions and the nature of the work and that the workers are involved in themselves. Because I think these are, if I'm correct, the local is split. These were first responders and largely paramedics. And that relationship that paramedics have with firefighters, with police, whose own unions have been right-wing for some time. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. That might clarify some things because I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that much broader than that because this local is actually comprised of like hundreds of different job classifications. Paramedics are a group within that. These are highly paid workers. They were by far the best paid workers as a group within that local. Many of them are inside workers, enjoyed better working conditions. Many of them continue to be able to work from home. So within the spectrum of, different working conditions, I can say that there was always much more traction for left-wing politics within the workers who are making minimum wage, low wages, are not treated well by employers. And I wouldn't say it was just the paramedics. I think yes, I think generally speaking, paramedics don't have progressive politics, if I could put it that way, that they do tend to identify with police, with firefighters. But I wouldn't just say that that was the sole and determining factor at all, right? I think it's this idea among paramedics is like trade unions as opposed to industrial unions, right? The idea of we have something in common because we all work for the same employer is not how the thought process goes. I think the thought process is we do a very specialized and specific job, and so we are undercompensated because of that. And our community of interest is actually with other paramedics or other first responders, right? And yes, I think the day-to-day work with the police of that professional group is something that definitely, shifts politics in a different direction, and that the identification does tend to go in that direction.
So can you say something about how you think the federal Conservatives, and since you're both in Ontario, we could also talk about the PCs in Ontario under Doug Ford, their particular way of trying to appeal to working class people in general and unionized workers in particular?
Okay. There's a lot to unpack there with the rise of Doug Ford and his appeal, and also some of the Conservative backlash against Doug Ford in Ontario as well, which is interesting. I think to go back a little bit in Ontario politics, we can talk about federal politics at the same time, because this trend is sort of moving lock and step with one another. It wasn't that long ago, just over a decade, when Tim Hudak was leader of the Progressive Conservatives in Ontario, when he tried to fight an election on making Ontario a right-to-work province. He wanted to greatly restrict the power of unions, and he was leading in the polls, but he lost. And he actually woke up the labor movement, the OFL, the teachers, and they actually really put a lot of electoral effort into fighting back that election. And of course, Hudak lost his position as leader of the party. I think now he's a director of the Ontario Real Estate Association or something. He's left politics. And Doug Ford steps in and has a very different approach to speaking with workers and to dealing with unions. And he's a populist, and he makes a lot of appeals to workers, not all of them genuine, not all of them deliverable, but he does speak to workers in a way that the left has not been able to. And I think it's really interesting with Ford is his strategy that he's used with particularly labor unions. So he speaks to workers directly, but behind closed doors, he speaks to labor unions, and he's been to get increasingly a larger number of endorsements politically. And but that's not necessarily always a purely ideological shift within the membership or the elected leaders that are driving this, because a lot of elected leaders are being transactional with Ford. They're selling endorsements, literally. And I don't say that lightly. The Carpenters, for example, recently endorsed Ford in the last election, the first time in their history they've done that. 30 days prior to the endorsement, they received multiple $1 million to build a training center for carpenters. United HRE Local 75, a union of predominantly racialized immigrant hotel workers, endorsed Ford. He also provided them with training money from the Skills and Development Fund. So there's a lot of this transactionalism that's happening for these supporters. Now, the vast majority of unions still support NDP, at least formally. Their members don't, obviously, but they do. But there's been this creeping opening to unions from conservatives, federally and provincially, that has taken root. And I think it's something that has a lot of implications that we're still not even fully aware of yet. Because even if union members are conservative or liberal and vote that way when their union endorses social democratic parties, it's a big psychological step if a union endorses the Conservative Party. It gives the license to those right-wing members to assert themselves in ways that I think they maybe didn't do in the past. And what we are seeing, and it's clear, I think Catherine's example, what's unique about it is that it's a clear public sector example. But the private sector unions, especially in the trades, have been supportive of conservative politicians for some time.
So I think there's a couple of things that I trace back to the pandemic, because I really feel like things changed during that pandemic. And one was the physical isolation that came with the pandemic and the lasting effects of that has increasingly isolated people, fractured any sense of community, broader society, and has made conservative politics all the more appealing. So specifically, like it wasn't just the isolation measures, but then the technologies that were introduced into daily interactions that have never really gone away, that have limited physical interactions, like sometimes just like really mundane physical interactions, like you go to check out your groceries. You used to have to interact with a human being. Now you just interact with a machine, right? People are still working from home a lot more than they used to. There's been massive changes in the education system where there is, again, an increased focus on technologies and utilization of technologies. And so within that context, I think there's even less and less sense in a society where there was so little sense of community to begin with, and the fact that like we are connected, that we do owe each other something, that's gone. Like that's been destroyed, as little of it as there was within a country like Canada. But also during COVID, the failure of institutions, the failure of state and other institutions to actually help people in a moment of deep crisis. And so a political party that's going to talk about cutting red tape, which you actually associate with some of the wrongs that might have been done to you during the pandemic, especially as a working class person, that is a politics that now resonates with you, right? Like We saw the politicization of public health, where there was constantly this denial that the disease was airborne because the state didn't have masks to give healthcare workers or to give to people, right? So we were told for over a year that this wasn't an airborne disease, right? Like that all leads to an erosion of trust. The collapse of long-term care homes, vaccination under threat of loss of employment, mass layoffs, and complete lack of centralized state response, of a proper like institutional response. People were given a check of $2,000 a month, a CERB check, and we're told, here you go, you're on your own, go figure it out, right? So within the context of these two trends, it's not surprising that politicians that continue echoing those same mentality, if you will, are the ones who are gaining traction, right? And I think that also has something to do with why people are increasingly turning to right-wing politics, and especially young people who this has been what's been happening for the majority of their life, right? So they're even more susceptible to those kinds of right-wing ideologies.
Yeah, I agree with everything Catherine said. I mean, in Canada, I think the Freedom Convoy really resonated and was important in so many ways. It was almost like both a symbol and a practical protest at the same time, and it just took a bunch of energy and anxiety and focused it in a very negative way. And with Poilievre, he went all in on it. He actually, technically, you could argue, he launched his federal campaign in Ottawa at the convoy. He marched with the protesters. He took dozens, if not hundreds, of photo ops with them, him and other conservative politicians. And he really played upon and reinforced the F. Trudeau sort of sloganeering that was going on before that, and just heightened throughout the convoy. And I think we never really came to terms on the left of what the vaccination mandates actually meant to people. We did not have a complex or nuanced messaging to talk to workers about it. It paralyzed a lot of the labor movement. I have a lot of friends who are union reps who are still, to this day, dealing with grievances over vaccination mandates and dismissals. That's all that reps were doing for almost 18 months. And I think the left, I think, really did not enter that space very well. And it was paralyzed by it. And if you look at what happened in Toronto when the convoy, of course, became a moving protest as well, the local labor movement did very little to counter the convoy. There were a couple weeks later, small demonstrations. It was very cold in January and outside of City Hall. I attended them, but they weren't anywhere near the size of the convoy protests themselves. And people were very critical of labor leaders who didn't mount a counter movement to the convoy protest. But I think the labor leaders were stuck because their members were in the convoy protest. And we never came to terms with that as well. What do you do when I was walking around the convoy protest in Toronto and I'm seeing uniform hats? I'm seeing Teamsters hats. And I think that's something that, as Catherine said, was that alienation that people felt during that time was something that the left did not, and unions themselves really failed to address. And the right just used it to their utmost advantage.
Do you want to add anything about Poilievre's approach? I mean, you talked before about Doug Ford, but do you want to say something more about the federal angle in terms of the calculated conservative appeals to working class people and the basis on which they do that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it didn't start with Poilievre. It preceded him. Aaron O'Toole had it as part of his mandate during the election. He actually made several overtures, more than his party wanted to organize labor. And he was sort of reined in. So if you looked at the conservative mandate during O'Toole's failed election, the overtures to labor were buried in, position number 168 or something. It was in that thick packet. It wasn't on the forefront that he sort of wanted it to be. But when Poilievre came in, he had a different strategy, and he really did try. And like Doug Ford, I call it the hard hat photo ops. these guys took every opportunity to get in front of a camera with union t-shirts and hard hats to show their openness to workers. And Poilievre followed Ford's effective model for this. Not all unions have really centered again on the trades, which I think we have to talk about, because that's very much based in a extractivist, productivist, and masculinist form of work. That's who the alignment is primarily with. And I think that's something that we have to be aware of. But Poilievre, on a policy level, also, he speaks the two sides of his mouth. He's very good at talking to the business leaders and saying, hey, I'm your guy. I'm going to rein in labor. I have a relationship with them. At the same time as he does these things that perplex the business community. For example, the federal conservative opposition under Poilievre did not vote against Bill C-58 and the anti-scab law in the Canada Labor Code. They let that go. Politically, they made a decision it's not worth the blowback, and they just let it go through. That may have been cynical on their part, but I think it's something where they are trying to really realign themselves with labor, maybe even talk about a new watered down deal where conservatives will guarantee unions the right to exist, because the neoliberal era, they were fighting against the existence of organized labor in exchange for very limited power, limits on the power to strike, limits on their political power, and ability to perhaps support rival parties in elections. But it was clear that conservatives and far right groups across Europe, North America, and other jurisdictions are trying to make new alliances with organized labor that just did not exist in previous decades.
I think what we're dealing with then, and we might want to just talk about this a little bit before we move on, is a combination of certain tactics on the part of conservative politicians, and the way those then intersect with ways of living, and ways that working class people are trying to get by, survival strategies, whatever we want to use to talk about that, whatever way we want to talk about it, right? And the way that in working class it's increasingly fragmented, atomized, or we could say decomposed, that the kind of individualist way of trying to get by and be hyper competitive way of trying to get by is particularly susceptible to those kinds of appeals, right? From conservative politicians, whether it's around tax cuts or other things. I guess the next question we should dig into is about the responses from union officials who don't support the conservatives to those kinds of conservative appeals, and how effective those actually have been. What's your perception around that, your assessment?
So I think union officials are moving further to the right because that is the direction in which their members are moving, and they are counting votes. And so if you want to continue being a union official, that is where your politics are going to need to shift, right? And it's the easiest way to hold union office is to basically cozy up to the employer and to cozy up to those in power. I also want to talk about increased support for Canadian foreign policy, which we are seeing from union officials, right? So you have top union officers who were proud to be in the legislature in late 2023 for the announcement, liberal announcements of support for the war in Ukraine. Well, there was a World War II Nazi veteran who got a standing ovation, right? And we saw union officials on social media bragging that they were at that event. We most recently saw representatives of the CLC that were proud to be in the legislature to meet with the British King. And so as the ruling class and as politicians are increasingly co-opting union leadership in order to help them, as opposed to taking an adversarial approach, which is more of what we saw in line with, for example, the Tim Hudak conservatives, that's that they were going to cut 100,000 public sector jobs, right? They're co-opting labor, and labor is playing game, right? And it's very easy to do when you see that that's the direction that your members are shifting in as well. Also on the question of tariffs and basically the entire union leadership standing with Canadian capitalists in defense of the Canadian state as anti-immigration policies are on the rise. as if the interests of capitalists and workers are one and the same in this situation, right? And I think only one side is gullible enough to believe that, and that is our side, unfortunately, because now you're seeing Bill 5 coming out in Ontario. It was passed, the creation of special economic zones where when Parliament deems, when the Ontario legislature deems an area to be a special economic zone in this fight between the US and Canada, right, that there will be no legislature that needs to apply in those areas, right? There will be no labor legislature that applies. Indigenous rights, land rights will not apply in those special economic zones. And it's interesting to see where that's going to go, because on first, as this bill has just been passed, there's a lot of pushback from Indigenous communities. We'll see what that translates into. And union officials seem to be standing up and saying, this is wrong, and we're going to take our cue from Indigenous communities, and we are also going to fight this. So I'm very curious to see where that goes as well.
Yeah, I think Catherine hints at, a way of almost flipping the question is that we want to look at asymmetrical radicalism, as you put it in your introduction, as this rise of the right and the rise of the left, even if it's smaller, and greater militancy, that's happening at the same time. And there's evidence of that in the labor movement. There always has been. There are anti-Zionist groups forming in unions. There are groups that are trying to ban arms trade and delay shipments. And there are examples of that in the US and Canada that have been, have some success. But at the same time, we're asking what the union is actually as an institution within capitalism, because labor and capital are both within the same system. Unions are they playing a role in fostering the right of the far right by doing these things, by taking these strategic stances and accommodationist perspectives, and not launching any effective fight back against the far right at the time, and how it plays into all different parties. Just because the far right, Stormfront, doesn't have a political member in Parliament, doesn't mean that they're not influencing policy and having their anti-immigrant ideologies reflected in policy by mainstream parties. We see that all the time. And this is where I think the real dangerous part is. You have unions who are endorsing and calling for the abolition of temporary foreign workers program. Now, the left has been critical of the temporary foreign workers program for decades. I can't even tell you how many theses I've read criticizing the temporary foreign workers program. But if you talk to workers under that program, they don't want to be deported either. So this is the contradiction, and they want a more just immigration system that's fair. And I think this is where we're into some really interesting times going forward, is to seeing where does it stop, and how well, as Catherine said, where does the right's infiltration of labor movement come in? There are right-wing, far-right, I would even call them far-right union officers in power in unions right now, in all kinds of unions, that publicly, if you go on their Facebook pages, you see far-right postings betraying what their ideologies really are coming from. And I think this is where we have to ask ourselves, what kind of pressure does need to be put from within unions by progressive rank and files to actually stem this tide? And I think that's a lot of work to do. And it's also potentially very divisive, because there may come a time where, we've had them before, where union central labor bodies have to split on an issue. And maybe like communism was a dividing issue in the AFL-CIO, last century. Will we see two rival union federations in English Canada split on the issue of allegiance to right-wing parties?
So I did, Steve, you brought up a really good point, which is that there is actually also left-wing organizing going on within unions, and we can't forget that. And that's really important, because I think the question is, so how do we actually build on that and move that forward? That's, I think, the relevant question here, right? And so I'm just going to say I was at the CUPE Ontario convention just a couple of weeks ago. There was an international solidarity committee that put on an event after the convention was done. It was like at 7:00 at night, not mandatory attendance. It was entitled From Tariff Wars to Hot Wars, about international solidarity. And so I attend this event. 80 people out of a convention of 900 people show up past 7:00 in the morning. Past 7:00 at night. Everybody's been doing convention business since 7:00 in the morning. And I'm sitting there and I'm listening to basically 3 old communists that are talking about international solidarity and the international working class and how all workers of the world should unite. And the audience is mesmerized, and like people literally after the event is over won't even leave, because for the duration of the entire convention, that seemed to be like one of the very few spaces where you can have real political discourse about something different than what's on offer everywhere else. Right. And so I was literally struck by how much pull that event had and how it resonated with people. And so, and let's also not disregard that there is a rising wave of strikes as well that's happening at the same time. Right. And that there is this shifting to the left among segments of the working class as well, and that these ideas are resonating, because at the end of the day, the Conservative Party isn't offering any answers to this crisis. It's just offering more of the same crisis. And the NDP is the NDP that the NDP has always been, and there's nothing new or interesting coming out of there or anything that's speaking to workers at all, in fact, which is why they keep losing votes, right? And so I really think, maybe particularly after the experience that I've had, is that we do need some sort of organization that's more durable. I'm not talking about a party, but an organization where workers can connect with anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist politics, and we have a way to get those politics out, and that we are supporting left activists that are doing organizing in their workplaces, whether around strikes or around any other workplace issue, because there are no small number of us. It's just we all seem to be working in isolation from each other. We don't have a central organization where we can come together and put those ideas out more publicly and offer support to each other and have a mechanism to draw more workers in.
I think you bring up something that's really important, and I want to circle back to it before we end the conversation today. But before we pick up on that, anything you want to say? Just I think it's worth pausing again, just to focus in on to understand the sections of union officials who are worried about the Conservatives' appeal, right? Hardcore NDP supporters, for example. Anything you've observed in terms of how they have been responding? I'm not suggesting it's necessarily an effective response, but anything that you've seen in terms of their response to what they know is happening, what the Conservatives are doing, and the resonance that that's having, and any thoughts about the impact or lack of impact of what they're doing?
I think there's no new ideas. There's no pivoting. I actually haven't seen any kind of real reckoning with this idea of continuing to tell workers that the NDP is your answer, while it increasingly is not the answer. So I think from what I've seen, union officials are picking up on the fact that workers are done with the NDP, but I would say that there's no real answer or reckoning or trying to grapple with how do we deal with that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, also, I think it's those left leaders of labor institutions, even if they're not reflective of far-right sentiments of some of their members, they're being disciplined by them. And that's, I think, the really negative thing we see. So, I mean, one of the most bright spots we've seen in the Ontario labor movement in recent years was the election of J.P. Hornick to the leadership of OPSEU, following Warren Smokey Thomas, who was allegedly, we're supposed to say allegedly, a very corrupt leader. And this was seen as something of a really breath of fresh air for the labor movement. Now, this wasn't spontaneous. J.P. Hornick and their team fought to gain the displace Smokey upon retirement and put his successor, chosen successor aside. That was a 10-year battle. They fought for a decade. So it's a long haul of organizing to make these kind of reforms. But even Hornick's reelection for a second term was contested, right? And a lot of her opponents or their opponents really used their stance on Palestine against them. And I think that was something that makes a lot of leaders who have progressive politics, either anti-Zionist or anti-capitalist, a little bit, you can understandably be gun shy about speaking out. But sadly, we're at a time where there has to be some pushback against the far right. And that's something I think we're going to continue to struggle with. And we're going to see, for example, I think in some unions, following the example of Trump in the US, and again, with the shift of the liberals to the right, David, you and I are old enough to remember when anti-racist education was taken seriously by the labor movement for the first time in several contexts, even if it, had its flaws. But does that kind of DEI education that has a long history, is that going to be pushed aside? Because it's those hard conversations workers don't want to have anymore, or perceive not to want to have anymore. And even we have to ask, is that type of traditional anti-racist education that might have served a purpose 10 or 20 years ago, is that necessary in our institutions, or do we need anti-fascist education? And that's something that is a whole different program and to be undertaken. So it's a very long haul, I think, ahead of us to rebuild organizations and to put these things in place to stop the tide that's might be at the doorstep, so to speak.
I'm curious if either of you have seen any responses in terms of stepping up of education or action in some way around anti-trans politics, around racism, or any of those kinds of buttons that have been pushed by the right. That is things that have been done within unions over the last couple of years. Have you noticed any useful or less than useful responses?
I mean, I think this is is one of those things where I really struggle, right? Because I think the response to racism has been identity politics, right? And so, like, I can only speak to CUPE. There's an attempt to build racialized leaders to take on leadership positions in the workplace. And that's really, I would say, where the largest focus has been, is around representational politics, right? Like, if we just get more racialized folks, more queer folks into union leadership positions, this issue will somehow go away. But there's issues with identity politics, right? And one of the things that was so interesting being in this forum with these three communists is they kept referring to, like, the scientific method. Like, we actually need to examine things with the scientific method, like social phenomena, right? And coming back to materialism, right? Like, the idea of materialism, which is so often lacking in any of this anti-racist education because it becomes solely about identity, right? And then you can have Zionists show up at the CUPE Ontario Convention or whatever union space and interject and say, I am Jewish. You can't tell me that what is being said is an anti-Semitic, because I am Jewish. And so I am going to tell you what is and what is not anti-Semitic. And to me, like, that example, like, and when somebody's standing on a convention floor and saying this, and you're seeing 900 people convinced that that is actually true, right? And they're going to vote against a motion that says we oppose colonialism and we oppose imperialism, because somebody got up and said, I'm Jewish, and what you're doing is anti-Semitic, and you can't tell me otherwise. That is the shortfall of identity politics, and that there's no material reality. There's no exercise of, like, okay, but actually what materially is happening in the world, which is why what you're saying makes absolutely no sense, right? And I think identity politics has taken that out from the equation, and in the long term, like like I told you, right? It was DEI committees that are being used to do Zionist organizing within employers. Employers are using these committees to say there isn't an issue because we have a DEI committee. And so let's congratulate ourselves about how we've dealt with racism in the workplace. Meanwhile, racism continues in the workplace, just like it did before.
Yeah, and I would just mention that at Winnipeg Labour Council, to which I'm a delegate from my union, I've had some brushes with Canadian Labour Congress education materials or programs recently, and the stuff that they do around what's like, you can't even say it's about responding to anti-trans politics. It's, I guess, basically a kind of liberal education around pronouns and gender identity, which, well, maybe better than nothing. There's no working class politics integrated into it, right? No sense of how these kinds of attacks are being used to pursue a broader political agenda. No taking on, the arguments that really would need to be taken on in order to equip activists to be more effective in the workplace, talking to coworkers around these things. So, I do think that what you said, Catherine's important around the limits of the liberalism of the responses to racism and other forms of oppression that we've seen. So obviously those programs need to be defended against the right, but they're politically, they have lots of limits to them.
Yeah, I would agree with that very much so. I mean, we have, bright spots in the labor movement. There's all these, we call them these militant particularisms that arise from different things that really protect, certain groups and may not easily spread out. But there are examples of, I'm thinking some stuff that I've seen in the 3900 locals where trans activists have really done the hard work of trying to make those links through materialist and Marxist analysis and understanding that, capitalism shapes our bodies and normalizes our bodies. And trans activism is about saying that there's more than just two genders. It's more complex than that. And you don't have to fit into this system under these constraints when that's not the reality of so many people's lives. But making those links to how anti-trans sentiments are very much about reproducing a neoliberal world order and normalizing bodies for production and consumption is something that's very difficult to do. And those are very difficult conversations to have, especially in a lunchroom and in a sector where it's a predominantly male workspace. But that work has to be done. And I think you're right, David. The work that's being done right now isn't, as I said, we need to move beyond some of those workshops that we've been doing for the past 20 years.
I'll just mention for listeners who might not have caught Steve's reference that the 3900 locals, that's CUPE locals whose numbers are like 3902, 3903, 3909, and so on, which are university sector academic workers locals, which used to be years ago affiliated to the Canadian Union of Educational Workers, some of them. But that's old history. But let's now talk about, what would be more effective, right? People who are in unions who want to actually weaken the appeal of right-wing politics, who want to push back and organize. Catherine, you talked earlier about the need to try to create some kind of organization for left labor people, right? I mean, hopefully that's an accurate paraphrase of what you were saying. But thoughts you'd like to share about, things that we could do going forward, picking up on any useful initiatives that you've seen that you think might be generalized, or other things that could usefully be done? Because I think from what you've both said, and I agree, we shouldn't be just waiting for an effective response to come from the union officialdom.
Yeah, I think you're right, David. It's going to have to come, I guess, from below, to use that metaphor. And I mean, what I'm really concerned about now is, before we ask what we can do, is we have to sort of ask what we maybe shouldn't do in response to this. And it took about 15 minutes we've seen in the current conjuncture, for example, with the trade war being initiated by Trump, for many on the left and the labor movement to almost like they had it in a closet waiting for them, pulling out that old left nationalist jacket and to put it on again. And so we have, labor leaders who are very much in line with the elbows up discourse and pledges for Canada and these kind of things, which do nothing at all about building the working class. If anything, it's just about building a temporary alliance to protect maybe national bourgeois, capital, and nothing to really branch out and build alliances with workers. And it's difficult. I mean, it's hard to tell workers in Canada that we need to reach out to workers in the US when those labor leaders are throwing Canadian workers under the bus, right? Like Sean Fain did. But there are workers and there are locals in the US around Windsor, Detroit, who have sort of voice that maybe, this tariff war against Canadian workers isn't the only solution to protecting jobs. So I think there's just a broad anti-capitalist analysis and internationalist analysis that has to happen in dealing with these the far right that doesn't simply reinforce local nationalisms, which is the pinnacle in many cases of far right movements. It's white nationalism and the national question. And I think we need to start doing that first. How do we do that? Again, it's a lot of work, but I do think we have to really, maybe push our institutions to talk about anti-fascist solidarity pacts. Can unions come together and say, we're not going to support this, this, and this? And maybe, at least bringing the conversation to unions, that unions have an important role in fighting the far right, because the far right doesn't necessarily protect unions like they say they're going to. The history is that unions are replaced completely by the temporary far right leadership, and unions are dispelled, and labor leaders are imprisoned or worse. And I think if we want to see how far the far right goes in this current juncture, so there's simply a great deal of work to be done.
I think, I don't think any of these answers are going to come from union leadership. I think unions are so tied in with capital. They're tied in with colonialism of this society. And so I don't, and just I'll be honest with my personal experience of being the president of a large local, I felt like a good portion of the time I wasn't necessarily fighting employers. I was fighting my own union in order to get support for workers to challenge the employer, because these institutions fundamentally operate within a legal capitalist framework. And that is the framework that they then push back onto workers, right? There's such a hesitancy about strikes. We're seeing workers going out on strike. There's no strategic analysis of how do we even make these strikes successful, because ultimately we're here to work in cooperation with employers. That is the fundamental legal framework within which these unions operate. And so I'm increasingly turning my mind to building spaces and organizations outside of formal union structures, which, again, I will say the majority of the organizing that we did that was successful in my local was because we started breaking out of using the traditional structures that were given to locals in terms of how to do organizing. And so I don't look to the union leadership. I think we use that where we have union leaders who are favorable to these politics, right? That we use what we have at our disposal. I'm not saying that unions are completely corrupt and there's nobody there that is interested in advancing left politics, but that is not the direction from which any kind of winning struggle is going to come from. And I can confidently say that after having sat within those structures for the last 6 years, right? And I also think that, I think, Steve, you touched on it, this is a colonial society, right? And those dynamics are very much there and are very much prevalent. And the entire idea of class is not really rooted in this society because it was about, the white class, right? As opposed to the people that we colonized in this society. And that is a tremendous hindrance to building the idea of working class solidarity and working class solidarity across borders as well.
Yeah. So we have the reality of a multiracial working class, right? Of many genders, many, large numbers of working class people whose interests are threatened by the right. But where there's no political organization that's on a mass scale, or for that matter, really on smaller scales in a significant way, really trying to actually promote class organization and radical politics of one kind or another. So I think we have to be creative improvisers where we find ourselves, because the situation in Toronto is going to be different from the situation in Winnipeg and so on. We need to work with elements of the labor left where it exists, and where it doesn't exist, we need to try to create new initiatives and try to share experiences across different different spaces, different places, because there's no existing pan-Canadian network or any kind of organization that we can just pick up and run with, right? So I think there's lots of work to be done, but I'll just mention for listeners who might not have heard previous episodes of this podcast, episode 52 was about workplace organizing, which Catherine was a participant in, and that was specifically about the case for people who are committed to radical social change becoming involved in workplace organizing, which is crucial for this, the topic that we've been talking about here, right? People who are on the left, not just living a dual life where you do your paid work and then you do your political activity in the community and you're not involved in the union. It's really important for people to be politically engaged in and around their unions. But as Catherine said, organizing independently, creating new initiatives, new kinds of organizations. And then also I'll just mention that episode 50 of this podcast was about the tariff war, so-called, and the importance of an internationalist working class response to that rather than a nationalist one where unions would be forming explicit or tacit alliances with bosses under the Canadian flag. Before we wrap up, any thoughts about issues or aspects of this set of problems that we haven't talked about that you'd like to take a stab at, or any final thoughts? Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcasts wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Poilievre, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com. David here with an announcement about a special offer for listeners of Victor's Children. If you order Red Flags directly from the website of Fernwood Publishing, you can get a 15% discount from now until 6 months after the release of this podcast episode. So just go to Fernwood Publishing and use the code RF15. That's RF as in Red Flags, 15, as a discount code to get 15% off orders of the book. Hope many of you will take advantage of this offer. Thanks for listening.